Ladies and gentlemen, today is July 14th, 2024, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Hello?
Yo.
Hey, how are you?
Pretty good, yourself?
Oh, doing okay. Just a little travel anxiety.
Where are you going?
Pacific Northwest.
Oh, yeah, Seattle, you told me.
Yeah.
How long are you going to be up there?
Oh, what is it, like 5 days?
Cool.
It'll be a while.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, traveling is nice, but the downside is that it involves leaving the house.
Yeah. It always makes a hermit feel weird. They're like, this isn't my shell. What is this place? Where are my books on the floor?
Therein lies the rub.
Yep.
So I'll have to find something to do.
When is that again?
I'm leaving tomorrow.
Oh, sweet. I hope you have a great trip, and it's smooth, and you have good weather. You're going at a very good time. It should be heavenly weather if it's as usual for July. Let's see. I think it's still in my weather app. Yeah,
The forecast I saw was 80s for the next week.
80s is the high, yeah. That's so nice. Well, that'd be a good break from the Texas heat.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Dallas weather, and it's going over 100 Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday.
Yep. Excellent advertisement for air conditioning.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've made some good progress in our Baldur's Gate run. I told you just in DMs that I adjusted the spec of my character in our run to include some paladin levels, which should give us more frontline, more sustain with some heals, and then also more damage just from my character. So looking forward to that. We can do that whenever we've rounded out most of the news. And I know the chat is very excited because we had a major news item this week that's all over the news. Spain beat England in soccer. That's really big. All over the news.
Surprised you didn't go for Richard Simmons.
Yeah, some people in chat did that yesterday. Today, I think it was TRJ and Z said Spain beat England in Neuro 2024.
Well, congratulations, Spain.
Also, my estimate is that 3 people will get permabanned during the chat for today's discussion. That's not trying to be mean. It's just that anytime you say the names of soon-to-be elected U.S. presidents in any Twitch chat, there are some people who jump out of the woods and they're like, now's my time for really mean argumentation just by quoting the quips of my TV people. And if you keep at that and the mods talk to you and they say, hey, can you tone it down? And then you just keep quoting Tucker Carlson, you're going to run into trouble. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes today, but we have mods at the ready, so chat, be on your best behavior, or at least try. So jokes aside, there were shots fired at a rally, and Trump got some ear damage, but is otherwise okay. The shooter was killed, and there was one person who was killed as well, a bystander. But I think it was 2 dead and then 2 critically injured was the ouchie.
Yep, that sums it up.
Cool. And I'm sure there are lots of theories and so on, but I haven't really been on the news too much. The chat has been mostly a safe haven from focusing on that because a lot of it is just going to be people hyperventilating. But we've been really looking forward to a sobering take. Agent Smith, what happened? What's going on? We need to be sobered up.
Sobered up? Well, I mean, a major act of political violence could be sobering, but, you know, given where the political culture is right now, I doubt it's going to have that effect on people. So this could be the beginning of further political violence, depending on how people respond to it. That's sort of one of the big question marks going forward. I'm not entirely optimistic in that regard, but it's entirely possible also that this is just a one-off. Because I don't know if you heard, but they did identify the shooter.
Yeah, I think they said they were registered Republican or something, which was kind of weird.
He was registered as a Republican, but before he registered as a Republican, he had donated to a Democratic-leaning PAC. So make of that what you will. It could be that he was a Democrat who wanted to vote in the Republican primary, which is not uncommon in a lot of places, especially places where the Republicans are pretty much a lock. But I don't think Pennsylvania is one of those places. I'm pretty sure that's more of a battleground state.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not entirely clear yet just what his leanings were, or certainly not his motivation at this point. We're going to have to wait probably around a week or so before any details about that come out.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely a lack of clarity with that regard. He did have fatigues on, which, maybe not surprising given that what he was doing.
What does that mean? You have fatigues on?
Like combat fatigues.
I don't know what
like
that
camouflage.
Is. Oh, okay.
And it was noted by some people online that his shirt had demolatia, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, which is apparently a well-known gun YouTuber.
Mm.
So, yeah, I mean, any real theory about what was motivating him based on that information or any of the other information that's come out is just pure speculation. So, the real answer is we don't know. Mm-hmm. And really, it could go any number of ways. Like, it could be he was a Democrat, socialist, radical, or he could be radical right-wing, because there's actually a lot of people on the radical right that really don't like Trump.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a lot of libertarians that don't like Trump. I don't know if you saw it, but Trump actually did go to the libertarian convention a couple months ago and was pretty roundly booed while he was there. Which, is not that surprising if you know much about libertarians, but I guess Trump didn't know that much about them because he didn't seem to be prepared for that.
Mm.
And I would point out, too, that it's not inevitable that a would-be assassin trying to kill a politician is necessarily politically motivated. I would point out Huey Long as an example. He was a well-known populist politician in 1930s America. And some people thought he had the potential to become a dictator in the United States. And so when he was killed, shot to death, as it happens, there was a lot of speculation. And it turned out that the guy who killed him was the son of I believe, judge whom Huey Long had fucked out of a position. Basically, Huey Long was a politician in Louisiana, and Louisiana politics are very corrupt. There's a lot of quid pro quo. And what had happened is that this judge, had expected a position, and Huey Long had basically denied it to him. And so that was seen as basically a breach of what had been some kind of informal agreement between them. And his son was sufficiently mad about it that he shot Huey Long to death. So personal vendettas are actually a perfectly viable motive for a potential political assassin. And so it could be that there was something like that here. Probably unlikely, given that the shooter was only 20 years old, and it's not known at this point, what connections he might have had with any actual politicians or other people that may have had a direct connection to Trump. At this point, it looks more like he was a lone wolf. But that could change. It's, again, all speculation at this point.
Yeah, so I would guess it's going to take a bit of time to collect all the relevant sources of information about motives and so on to really know exactly what the reasoning was.
Yeah.
People probably can make up theories a lot faster than we can confirm anything, so.
Oh, yeah. I don't think it'll have a big impact on the election, because I think people I think people who are really politically involved already kind of know who they're going to vote for, pretty much regardless of what's going to happen. So the real impact here, if any, is going to be on people in the center. And we've talked before about how this is an election that is going to be decided by a veritable handful of people in the political center in a veritable handful of swing districts within swing states.
Mm-hmm.
So how they are affected by this is going to really determine what, if any, long-term effects this has on the outcome of the presidential election. And that's totally up in the air. Like, it'll probably be a week or two before any polling is done in that regard to give us an idea. Intuitively, I don't know that it'll be that big a difference, but I think it'll probably work in Trump's favor. I would have to assume that if it has any effect, it'll be beneficial to Trump. But whether or not that's a significant benefit, or whether or not it's a lasting significant benefit that is eventually overshadowed by other events, that is totally unclear as well. I would point out, like I did the last time, we talked about the election, that this is still relatively early. There's several months to go before the election happens, and that's plenty of time for more drama. And I don't doubt that we're going to be in for plenty more. There's going to be lots of twists and turns to come. This is probably a bigger twist and turn than I was expecting when I predicted that a couple weeks ago. But yeah, stuff like this, although hopefully less dramatic, will probably define the next couple months. So there's more to come in that regard. So I don't know that this is going to be the defining event of the election. We shall see.
I'm guessing you saw the footage and everything from it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I saw some of the early footage posted on TikTok of the shooter last night. He came very close.
Yeah.
Nicked his ear. And some people are saying that if he hadn't, that is to say, Trump, if Trump had not turned his head at exactly the same time as the shot, then it would have hit him pretty much dead on.
Huh. Do they know how far away he was?
400 feet is what I heard.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty decent shot, given that that was the first shot.
Mm.
I don't think it's entirely fair to call him a dime store Oswald like some people were online.
Mm.
That's a decent shot for 400 feet. And I don't think he had any more. I mean, it's not clear how many shots he got off, because the Secret Service was returning fire pretty quickly. I think, a couple of people were hit, so probably he got off a couple, but I don't think anything more than that first shot came anywhere close to hitting Trump. I would point out, just as a side note here, that the fact that the only people who were actually substantively hurt or killed were innocent bystanders is a really good metaphor for how political violence generally goes. People may think that by perpetrating political violence that they're striking a blow for whatever cause they think they're fighting for, but invariably the people they're targeting do not bear the brunt of that. Rather, it's just people who are trying to stay out of it, people who are not involved, just regular people bear the brunt of any kind of substantive political violence. And there's plenty of examples in history that are testament to that. Italy during the Cold War, excellent example. The so-called years of lead saw a pretty significant amount of political violence between far left and far right, and didn't really seem to move the needle that much, but it certainly scared the shit out of people and made Italy a more dangerous place to live. So it doesn't really need to be said, but I guess maybe it does. Don't murder people you disagree with politically. It's not recommended. It's not going to go well. It doesn't reflect well on you, certainly. So don't do that. In so much as, the guest speaker on a StarCraft Twitch stream can kind of impact that. But yeah, that's a message that apparently does have to be shared at this point. So we'll see if there's more to come. It's still, again, early, so there's plenty more time for other wackos of various sorts to kind of pick their target, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, I don't have a lot to add. I mean, I think most of what there is to be said about it has already been said. Somebody tried to kill a major presidential nominee. It's the first time it's happened since the early 1980s, since Ronald Reagan was targeted.
Mm-hmm.
And he was actually, he got a couple rounds into Reagan. He came very close to dying. But since then, been pretty quiet. There hasn't been a whole lot of political violence. Pretty much none against presidents. There's been attempts,
Teddy
but they've pretty much
Roosevelt?
all been foiled. Well, I'm speaking like since Reagan,
Oh,
since the
since
early
Reagan, yeah.
80s. Yeah, there hasn't been a whole lot. There was a guy who tried to fly a small airplane into the White House at one point back in the 90s. Couple other attempts, but again, nothing that made it this far. I guess there has been some talk as well about the Secret Service and how they, quote unquote, could have allowed this to happen, end quote. But I mean, there's going to be investigations. They're going to look into that. But my intuition is that this is just an example of how you can't catch everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even if you're making a best effort, like there's only so much you can do. And invariably, there's going to be some that get through sooner or later, some way, somehow. So this could just be the odds finally catching up to them.
Does Secret Service protect presidents and former presidents and like people running? What is the...
Yes.
Okay.
The answer to all three is yes.
Okay.
Yeah, they've been doing that since, I think, the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Secret Service has been around longer than that. Obviously, they were formed in the 1860s. But I don't think they've been doing necessarily former presidents until relatively more recently. Well, I say relatively. I got half a century is not relatively recently. It doesn't seem that long ago to me, but I'm getting older, so maybe that's just a tell.
Some people in chat are asking about the odds that this was orchestrated to gain favor.
By who?
By
Trump, presumably.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think it's likely. I mean, again, I think it was way too close a call for it to be staged. I think if it was going to be staged, it would have been like a miss. You know, maybe get people in the crowd at most, but nicking the ear says to me that it was a serious attempt.
Yeah.
Like, that very easily could have gone very differently.
Yeah,
Trump.
if you want to miss, you don't aim for the ear.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's that. But yeah, just missing by inches, that doesn't seem like a staged attempt to me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if he missed by like a couple yards or something, then maybe. But no, he was clearly aiming for the head. A pretty consequential couple of inches, as it may be.
How have the polls been since this happened? People were saying that, and obviously people who are in favor of Trump are going to be very excited by this, and they're going to say that it's in the bag now. But what's the actual change?
Too soon to say.
Too soon to say.
Yeah, you'll have to wait probably a week before pollsters can do anything. You know, it takes a while to do polling, unless you want to do like some bullshit poll, like an online poll or something. But you know, an actual rigorous survey is not something you're going to crank out in a couple of days. So it'll probably be a week or two before we get a substantive reading on the impact, if any, that the incident had. But of course, lots of people will be muling in the meantime. So yeah, there's definitely people who have come out with their hot takes about how it's going to change things.
Yeah, we already had to ban someone yesterday who was getting too fired up about it. They were like, take that, what I think they called people neocon libs. And they really stuck it to us. And we were like, hey, we're not really branding ourselves as neocon libs per se, and you don't need to keep bashing people. And they were like, too bad, facts hurt. And we were like, oh God, they're not going to stop.
Neocon libs, that's pretty rich.
Yep. We live in interesting times.
Oh yeah. We'll see how much more interesting they get. Something to talk with people about on the trip, I guess.
Yeah. You'll probably hear people talking about it. Airports are interesting environments for that reason.
Yeah. Hopefully less so airport security. I always get anxious going through security. I feel like I'm always forgetting something.
Yep.
I actually did at one point while I was in Beijing going through security forget to take off my what do you call it? Money wallet.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically one of those like little wallet things you hang around your neck and you can keep it under your shirt.
Mm-hmm.
So I had one of those and I forgot to take it off and I was like, oh shit. But it wasn't a big deal. They just had me take it off, look through it.
Mm-hmm.
No big deal. Yeah, that was 2019 though. So maybe it would be different if it happened now. Not a whole lot of travel into Beijing these days, I don't think. Well, assassination attempts aside, what else was there that you wanted to get to?
Chat wanted to ask if you've ever smuggled something illegally on accident through security at an airport.
No. No. I'm a very boring person. I don't really carry illegal stuff around.
Why would he keep this illegal stuff?
Yeah, I don't have any like weird stories about I accidentally smuggled in my like 45 caliber pistol or something.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't have like a pound of cocaine that I accidentally put into my luggage and got it through the airport.
Oops.
Nothing so sexy. Probably the only interesting thing I carry are books. I don't think security really cares about those.
Why is he so nervous? He doesn't have a motivation to keep the illegal stuff, though. That's the issue. It's not his bag.
I don't need a reason to be nervous.
Oh, chat was
predisposed.
Oh, you're predisposed to being nervous?
Yeah.
Chat was asking the other day, what kind of music do you like?
I don't have any real consistent preferences. Just kind of whatever.
When do you listen to music?
Off and on. Maybe have something on YouTube going sometime.
Mm-hmm.
What was it I was listening to earlier? Sometimes the YouTube algorithm just throws shit at me and I'm like, sure, fuck it, why not? Let's see, airport stuff.
NATO summit?
No, I'm thinking of the music I was listening to earlier. Devil Delight, Volume 2, Erotic Soundscape, Sensual, Seductive, Ecstatic.
Don't tell me there's an image of a waifu.
Probably, yeah, I think so. Let me see.
That's how they get you.
Yeah. One of those.
They can mass produce those now. A lot of them, it's like some AI generated, slap a character from a video game, animate it slightly, 3 hours of just random crap mix. Get a whole bunch of views and ad revenue. Crazy.
Hey, whatever works, right?
Yeah. There are some questions, I think. We have Sea of Whiskey and Moss and Fuzzy Cord around. We told the mods to be on high alert. Chat hasn't been too crazy so far.
Let's see. I read an analyst saying that the shooting will make more people who would vote Trump actually go out and vote Trump on election day. It won't swing anyone, but will make more people actually vote. So yeah, this is the turnout argument. The idea is that because somebody tried to murder Trump, then voter turnout on the GOP side will actually increase. That's possible, but keep in mind, it was already going to be elevated because of the conviction, right? Because people think the fact that Trump was convicted was a reflection of a political persecution, right? They think it was an abuse of the Department of Justice. So there was already sort of this narrative going around that Trump is suffering and being persecuted as, the leader of the political opposition, and that already had people pretty excited. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how much further up voter turnout has to go there for the GOP. Certainly it could bump it, but I don't know that it'll be statistically significant. Why wasn't the roof secured? Are there instances where security was this lax in the past? Well, again, I don't know that the issue was that security was lax. I think they probably were covering the roof at some point, but, again, you just can't have eyes everywhere all the time. I think one of the issues is that the roof was, what do you call it? It wasn't flat, basically. It was kind of curved, if I remember correctly. So it could be that he was actually hiding behind the incline, and that helped hide his position. And keep in mind, too, that he was actually caught getting on top of the roof. There are people on TikTok and YouTube and whatnot, who did interviews with journalists, and they were saying that they actually saw him going up with the gun, and then they started squealing to the police saying, okay, there's a guy with a gun, he's getting up on the roof, blah, blah, blah. And so then the police kind of went after him, but they didn't obviously get to him in time. And I was reading earlier, and this was on Reddit, so, take it for what it was worth, but somebody on Reddit was saying one of the cops actually did climb up the ladder after him, but when he got to the top, and peeked over the side of the roof, the guy was looking right at him and had the rifle aimed right at him. And so he went back down and probably at that point called it in. So if that's true, it was probably pretty soon after that he fired the shots that he got off and was then subsequently killed by Secret Service snipers. Mm-hmm. So, the way people kind of are thinking about it is that, he kind of snuck up there and was hiding for a while and then got the shots off. Without anybody necessarily seeing it in time. But actually, everything just happened really fast. My understanding right now is that he crawled up to the roof and then got the shots off before anybody could really do anything. Do we know the specific firearm of the shooter? No. Well, let me clarify. I don't know. Last night, when I was checking, and then earlier today, pretty much everybody was saying that they were unaware. From interviewees on site to the FBI statements that have been released. Nobody's released any information, to my knowledge, to that effect. Yeah, the most I heard from one of the people interviewed at the site was that it was a rifle of some kind. So make of that what you will. Would it not good for the peace of the USA and maybe even the world if Trump and Biden are having dinner or some other event sort of together where they condemn violence and say political disputes have to be fought by words? I mean, yes, but that kind of just goes without saying. I mean, Biden has already come out and released a statement saying that he condemned the violence and that this is, bad for the country and whatnot. And Trump obviously has condemned it, predictably, understandably. So I don't know that, getting together and having a dinner or some sort is really going to change anything in that regard. It's already kind of public record that everybody thinks it's bad. At least everybody, politically speaking, Biden and Trump, as well as myriad other political leaders. Although, of course, there are some politicians who have come out and just tried to leverage this to their partisan advantage, but that's no shock. There's always those guys. Is it looking likely that Biden will step down? Not really. All of the all of the evidence I've seen suggests that he's just going to stick it out. I haven't seen any evidence that he has any inclination to step down and make way for somebody else. There is some momentum in terms of people, politicians, and donors announcing that they think he should step down, but there's also just as many, and in fact, probably more people who have come out and explicitly backed him. And he himself has issued numerous statements saying he's not leaving. So I think he's in it for the long haul, one way or the other.
Was his presidential debate performance like below par for how he normally is, or is he like that all the time now? Is that a bad day?
It was definitely a bad day, but I don't think he's necessarily much better, even when circumstances are more ideal. Because he had the NATO I think you mentioned the NATO thing, right? Where he had the NATO meeting and he had the statements.
Oh, man.
He issued the statements at the end of it, and it did not go particularly well.
Yeah.
It was better than the debate, but still not great. He introduced Zelensky as Vladimir Putin
God.
early in the meeting. So, that was kind of awkward, but, mistakes happen. That's not that bad in the grand scheme of things.
Unless you're Zelensky, in which case it's an atrocity of a mix-up.
Oh, well, Eastern Europe is all just kind of one big blur for a lot of Americans, so maybe not that surprising. But later on, I think it was more egregious when somebody asked him a question about, I think, him staying in the race or not, whether or not he would leave. And then he answered by talking about missiles to Ukraine, which seemed really non sequitur to me. I mean, he answered with a lot of confidence, so I almost thought that maybe I misheard the question. But I think it was the other way around. I think Biden misheard the question, and so he just kind of went off on this weird-ass tangent that I wasn't expecting. So that, for me, was more embarrassing than any of the other stuff he did.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there was also the Kamala Harris thing, where he mistakenly referred to her as Vice President Trump.
Yeah. Well, they look so similar, like it's an easy mix-up.
Yeah, there you go. So, not a sparkling performance there for him. It just kind of feeds into the whole narrative that he's too old for the job and that he's in decline and whatnot. I think it only ever gets harder to dispute that. But, as Biden himself has said, don't compare him to the almighty, compare him to the alternative. And that pretty much is the crux of his campaign at this point. He is not Trump. So if you don't want to vote for Trump, you kind of have to vote for Biden. So that's where we're at.
It's not the best place to be.
No, but, again, he's a coalition unity candidate. And there's pretty much no way to do that without being boring, if not uninspiring.
Mm.
Let's see. Do you believe any person with a felony should be president? Clarification, I'm just curious how I feel about the fact that a person with felony could still run and win the title of the President of the United States of America. I don't feel that bad about it. The idea that if somebody with a felony could be president. Because, there's always the possibility that someone, and I'm not saying this is necessarily Trump, but there is always the possibility that in future somebody actually could get a felony as a result of political malfeasance of some kind, basically a felony that is specifically designed to prevent them from running. So having that loophole open where somebody with a felony can run is not entirely bad. That is a kind of insurance policy against political fuckery. I think we talked last time about how part of the reasoning behind the Supreme Court ruling for presidential immunity, broad-based presidential immunity, is specifically to act as insurance against any potential future attempt by political rivals to sabotage the executive by just levying a whole shit ton of frivolous criminal charges against a sitting president. So, it's not necessarily a bad idea. I can see why people would not want it, but keep in mind if, some drug dealer, somebody who's like a genuine felon actually wins the presidency, that really says more about the voters than it does about the system, right? There does have to be some individual responsibility there. There's some degree of responsibility has to fall on the voters to vet candidates. And, if they want to vote somebody in like that, then, okay, there's not much you can do to stop that. Even if you did have the rule that felons couldn't run, if you have voters that are that dumb and bad, they're just going to vote somebody in just as bad anyway.
Come on, voters, let's do better.
Yeah, a lot of American political problems kind of come down to that. But that's not a vote winner, so you're not going to hear that from anybody.
Mm-hmm.
Heard an argument that this basically ends all conversation to replace either candidate. Interested to hear my take on that one. I don't think there was much of a conversation to replace Trump. He's pretty solidly the Republican nominee at this point. I don't think it's going to end talk about removing Biden. Certainly there's more momentum to Trump's candidate coming out of this, but like I said earlier, I don't think it's going to be decisive. There's still a lot of time to go until the election. So I don't think chat about Biden leaving is going away. That's probably going to continue for probably until the last possible minute, would be my guess. But yeah, I definitely would not agree that it ends all conversation. I think the idea that it does end all conversation is predicated on the assumption that this is a major significant event in the campaign. And while it is a major event, I don't think it's going to be decisive. So I don't think then that it's going to be the thing that swings major decisions about whether or not Biden leaves. Certainly not whether or not Trump leaves. I think the only way Trump leaves is involuntarily. Let's see. Why was the mainstream media so fascinated with Trump's cognitive ability but seems totally uninterested in Biden's current impaired state? I'm not sure where that comes from. I don't think hardly anybody has been talking about Trump's mental state. I think everybody pretty much knows what Trump's mental state is. That's a known variable. I think the debate really is more about Biden. Even on left-leaning media channels, there's been much more talk about Biden than Trump in that regard. Mm. I think there have been Democrat operatives, politicians, PR men, consultants, people like that who have come out and tried to shift attention to Trump's cognitive ability, some of the things he said. But I think that was just very, very clearly done at behest of, Biden's campaign. The Democratic Party does try to push narratives through various forms of political machinery, online, PR, emails, Facebook, social media, what have you, as an effort to try to shift the public conversation about Biden and Trump. And after the debate, one of the things that, you could see some of the clear-cut Democratic operatives doing was trying to shift attention back onto Trump. That's not surprising. That's pretty much what you would expect after Biden has a bad debate. But I don't think it really gained much traction. They weren't fooling anybody with that. Like Trump again is a chaotic candidate, and different people have different opinions about that. But that's known. Again, it's not unexpected. Like everybody knew Trump was going to be Trump in the debate, and that's exactly what they got. The only variable was what kind of Biden would they get, and what would the variety of Biden they got signify about Biden's chances. And as was, we got a weak showing, and that implied that Biden himself was probably not a strong candidate. So that's where the debate is, much more so than what kind of cognitive ability Trump has. And so we have a clarification. This was for the previous election cycle. Okay, and the mainstream was talking about Trump's cognitive ability, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Why aren't they concerned about either party this time? Well, they're definitely concerned about Biden again. There's been lots of talk about that. Why were they talking about Trump's cognitive ability in the last election, 2020? Did they? I don't remember that. I don't think really either Biden or Trump came in for a whole lot of scrutiny about the cognitive ability in the 2020 election. I know there were some people trying. There were definitely critics of Biden who were trying to make it a thing. And of course, there are always critics of Trump who are trying to make it a thing. But I don't think they gained much traction in 2020. But my memory is not great, so maybe I'm just not recalling it. Maybe this would be a good time for the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. More painfully obvious sometimes than others. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So, participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this because I'm slow and can't walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. But I do read it eventually, and I do enjoy the feedback we get.
You're not slow.
I've had some experiences that suggest otherwise. Maybe I'm not always slow, but I've definitely had my moments. Certainly more so as I've gotten older.
The world does move pretty quick.
let's see. So I think if I don't answer the questions correctly, if I don't get the crux of the question, feel free to elaborate or ask again. I'm happy to return to it. Will the U.S. be supporting Israel's war against Lebanon? Well, they're not at war yet, so there's no guarantee. It really depends on just what the catalyst is. If Israel just does it for the sake of doing it, probably Washington will be pretty critical, but otherwise apathetic. I don't think Biden is looking to start shit, really, with Israel right now, especially in a really tight election. But if the Lebanese, more specifically Hezbollah, do something especially provocative, I think the Biden administration would be much more willing to give Israel more leeway in that regard. But I think regardless of how it starts, Washington is not super interested in getting into another Middle Eastern conflict, even vicariously. So most likely it'll just be business as usual. They'll just continue arms sales as they've been doing. Basically just path of least resistance. Wouldn't the quality of the vote also be determined by the quality of the education system? Not necessarily, because you can find developing countries where the education system is probably objectively poorer than in developed countries where people still take the vote much more seriously, than people in some parts of America or other parts of the developed world do. It's easy to take the vote for granted if you've been living in a stable democracy with relatively peaceful conditions for your entire life. And I think there's a lot of people my age who have been suffering from that. The 1990s and to a lesser degree the aughts were relatively peaceful. And I think a lot of people kind of were spoiled by that. They don't really know how valuable it is that they have a liberal democracy, and they don't entirely take the responsibilities of maintaining it seriously. So that's not really a problem with education per se. That's more, again, just a cultural problem, a people problem, a historical problem. And those kinds of problems are very difficult to solve. So I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm saying don't improve education, do that. I do advocate for better education. But one of the patterns I've seen over the course of my life, over the course of old man Smith's long years on this earth, is that people tend to immediately go to education as a major factor for whatever particular problem is happening. Whatever political issue, they generally say, well, if we had better education, people would be better informed about that, people would vote better candidates into office, and there would just be overall better quality outcomes politically. And I don't think that's true. Better education is good, especially for people who lack access to even just basic education. But I don't think broad-based improvements in education are going to move the needle in terms of political culture, because that's not determined by, how educated you are. That's much more determined by overall political climate. That's determined by, how your parents voted. That's determined by perceptions, by media landscape, historical factors, that are path dependent, stuff like that. It's a multivariate problem. In other words, education is just one factor there. So just improving that one factor is not going to be sufficient in and of itself. If you're actually serious about improving the quality of voting, the quality of candidates, and the quality of political outcomes, you're really looking at getting in substantive activism, trying to shape and form a movement, and getting involved over a long period of time and engaging in a significant, sustained effort involving advocacy. And that's the kind of thing that's not going to pay dividends for like 10, 20 years, if at all. And that's not a sexy solution. People want the quick fix solutions. They want the easy bake solution to difficult political problems. And no such thing exists. The real way to avoid difficult problems is to try to take action to prevent them from becoming substantive problems in the first place. Because once they get to be problems, it's like turning around a super tanker, right? It can only be done slowly. Once you're at the point where it's a real problem, then you're already at a 10, 20-year commitment minimum. And anything beyond that is just, again, that's minimum. Like, that's give or take, a generation. So those are not easy problems to solve. That just takes sustained effort, real investment by people who are actually concerned about it, and a real effort to try to rebuild trust, which itself is a difficult problem. So let's see, why gerontocracy is prevailing in U.S. elections as of late. Dudes are really old. What leverages they have to pressure their parties to push them? It's not really about leverage per se. It's just more about seniority. It's not entirely. There is a random factor at play, right? Even if you have seniority, like, you're not going to get the nomination if you just can't do well in the primaries, and straw polling, and just there is kind of a meta game there going on in the background. There is a backroom of politics in which they do judge candidates based off of how successful they are at getting support and how much support from critical interest groups a given candidate can get. So it's not purely down to just who the guys in the back room choose, right? They are looking at other variables there. But seniority, does have its advantages. Hillary Clinton basically got the nomination because of that. It was her turn, so to speak. She fought a hard campaign against Obama. She did pretty well, but she was going to lose. And so rather than just withdraw from the campaign, they had this negotiation where, she would win some votes at the DNC, but would otherwise, her loss was like preordained. But she wanted it to be a strong loss rather than just withdraw and have all of the nominees at the DNC vote for Obama. And I suspect part of that negotiation is that she would get their support in the next election after Obama, after his second term, basically. And so, I don't think that was the decisive factor in why she got the nomination. I think, she did have to go through the motions of going through the primaries and whatnot and trying to have a strong showing. And I think she did well enough in that regard. But it certainly was to her advantage that she had that pre-existing support, that institutional support, as you might call it. But again, I don't want to oversell institutional support. You do actually have to run. So I don't think that's why, we're seeing older candidates. I would point out that Trump is not like a political animal. He's not a traditional politician. He was not a guy who rose up the ranks of the Republican Party, right? So the fact that he got the nomination is just reflective of the fact that he was able to fund his own campaign, and the fact that his message that he was an outsider, which was a credible claim in 2016, and that he wants to just break shit and tear shit down, that was very attractive at that moment and remains an attractive message even now, after however many decades there had been of basically de facto political stagnation on what were considered major political issues. So Trump just kind of swooped in, and his message was popular, and so he won. It wasn't the fact that he was old or the fact that he had seniority that won him that nomination. He was just the right populist candidate at the right time. So his age was almost irrelevant to that. He could have been 20 years on, he could have been 20 years younger or older, and it still would have played out pretty much the same for him. Biden, by contrast, was more of an insider. So I don't doubt that he was kind of working his connections to try to get institutional support. But ultimately, what won him the nomination is the fact that he had more support, well, relatively strong support, shall we say, amongst working class Democrat voters, and the fact that he had really strong support with African American voters. Again, it was that South Carolina primary that saved his candidacy back in, 2020. So he basically was able to just outmaneuver, Bernie Sanders and all of the other would-be contenders. So that was more important than anything. So I don't think it was really down to his age. And I would point out, too, that really Biden and Trump are pretty much the main reason people perceive that the candidates are getting older. But, that's it, right? Politicians at the state level, at the local level, at other national level offices, they're not that old for the most part. Certainly on average, the Senate and House have gotten older. But I don't think that's necessarily representative. You'll get your Mitch McConnells, your Nancy Pelosi, sure, but those are just guys who have been in power and refuse to step down. So in so much as that's what you're asking about, that's just down to better healthcare. longer life expectancy just allows older people to survive longer. And if you're a guy who's used to being in power, there's not really a logical stopping point to that, beyond the point at which you're just basically just too mentally jacked to continue in any capacity. So that allows older people to stay in those positions of seniority, like, say, Speaker of the House, Speaker of the Senate, for longer naturally. And it's just inherently harder, given rules of seniority in Congress and the House in particular, to dislodge them. So if there were changes to the rules in the Senate and House, that could maybe have an effect. That could maybe make it harder for people like that to hang on for as long as they do. But just, given the way the rules are written right now, seniority is a big deal. So that makes it very easy for them to stay on in those institutions. But the presidency doesn't have rules like that. Like, that's much more down to the voters and to institutional support. And age is just not as big a deal there. That's just the fact that we have really old presidential candidates is just historical happenstance, basically, at this point, I would argue. I'm open to debate on that. I'm not going to pretend like I'm a poli-sci guy here. I've studied it. I'm familiar with some of the precepts, but I'm not like an expert by any stretch. So no, feel free to dunk on me.
Yeah, just
the
because
invitation is open.
Just because these two candidates are super duper old doesn't mean they're all old. It just means they're mostly old. Yeah, I can feel the generational gap. Feels pretty weird to have someone that old who's running when so much of our lives these days is very technology based. Mm-hmm. So it feels sort of like if you're that old, you're kind of out of touch with the modern ways that we communicate. But I guess Trump used Twitter well enough to get banned, which is par for that platform.
Well, if it's any consolation, Neuro, the actual representatives themselves don't necessarily do a lot of the actual policy legwork involved with their jobs. It's actually their staffers that do a lot of that. And then they'll present them with the information. And then based off that information, they'll make a judgment call. Of course, lobbyists also play a role in that. And of course, there's political calculus, but that kind of goes without saying. But the idea that they're just totally technically ignorant is not entirely justified, given that they do have generally much younger people on their staffs that help them with that.
They have their staff millennial to help them.
There was a movie called In the Loop. Yeah, that's what it was, In the Loop. I remember watching that way back in the day. It's been a long time now. It was about, basically it was about the Iraq War, but more specifically it was a parody, it was a satire of the politics behind the Iraq War. And I think the movie itself was a spin-off. Yeah, spin-off from a BBC TV show, The Thick of It. And the TV show was basically just about a couple of politicians and, their experience within the British political system. And for the movie, they had those same characters, but then they also had some American characters so that they could get the other side of it. And it involved basically the politics behind building a coalition for the Iraq War back in the day. And, it's worth watching in and of itself. I would recommend it. But one of the scenes that I'm reminded of hearing you talk about, how old politicians are, and then me talking about how young the staffers are. There's actually a scene where there's a grizzled veteran British politician, Scottish guy, is supposed to meet with an American politician who is, similarly senior. But the American politician doesn't actually meet him in person. He just sends one of his staffers, and the staffer is like 20 years old. And the British guy took that as an insult and went on this long rant, which was pretty hilarious. So if you don't watch the movie, you should at least look that up on YouTube. That was a good scene. Yeah, I don't think the movie is called In the Loop. It was made in 2009. It's a British satire. Yeah, I don't think aides and staffers in Britain are quite as young as they are in America. There's a lot of young political activists who will get involved in one or the other party, and they'll kind of get involved with their local politician, and so they end up just kind of volunteering basically in Washington. Helps them build political capital, make connections, get experience, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But in turn, unusually young, uncomfortably so, perhaps.
Well,
for
yeah.
politicians from other countries.
Younger politicians you can pay less as well, and America has that go-getter attitude, so it's like, hey, these interns we can pay almost nothing.
Yeah, that's always helpful. Saves money. I think that's all we had for questions. So, if we don't have any more, is there anything else you wanted to get to?
I don't think there was anything else that I saw that super stuck out at me this week. Chad, do you know of anything? Anything big or interesting? Whenever you have a really big event like what happened on Saturday, kind of drowns out a lot of other stuff.
Yeah, I was pretty short on stuff before that.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that I was preparing for the trip and angsting about it didn't help.
Mm-hmm.
If nobody has anything they want to get to, then I'm going to talk about ass.
What? Okay.
The Alliance of Sahelian States.
Wow, okay. That's a good name for their group.
Well, in their defense, they're francophones. They use the French acronym AES, Alliance Estats Saheli.
But in English it would be
English.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're a three-nation alliance that was formed out of the three nations in West Africa that had coups that overthrew their government.
Mm-hmm.
These are the same governments that threw out the French and are in the process of throwing out the Americans in favor of working with Russian mercenaries in their various counterinsurgency campaigns. So this is Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, I believe. So they formed their own little alliance, the Alliance of Sahelian States. Doesn't really actually obligate them to defend each other, last I checked. It's a pretty mild alliance in the grand scheme of things. But they did announce in the past week that they were considering pulling out of ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, which had been the premier supranational organization in West Africa, and which had ambitions to being a kind of regional equivalent of the European Union. So that project had been in the making for several decades. It had gained substantial traction over the past 20 years. But then with the coups recently, the new military governments that were formed were on bad terms with ECOWAS, because one of the norms that ECOWAS wants to establish is that civilian governments be respected and not be just arbitrarily overturned by this, that, or the other coup plotter. Mm. Unfortunately, ECOWAS is not in the best of states right now, certainly not the largest state, Nigeria. So they were not able to field a substantive response to the military coups in the ass states. So the result is that not much was done. And so it's looking like ECOWAS is in danger of partial collapse, depending on further coups that may or may not happen, and depending on what happens with the AES states, if you prefer to call them that.
Yeah, they might have a rival group, Titties, that rises up to meet them. But that organization is a little bit more top-heavy. Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
Well done. Yeah, one of the problems with leaving ECOWAS is, there's two problems specifically that I read about. One is that all of the members of ECOWAS get freedom of movement, basically the West African equivalent of the Schengen zone. And so any states that leave that are going to lose that. And so that's going to have a detrimental impact on trade within the region, because a lot of economic activity is cross-border. People will migrate from place to place, country to country, to work in whichever plantation is harvesting, because there's a lot of plantations in West Africa. And the ability of people to move freely, to get work where it's available, is a mainstay of the regional economy, to the point where the disruption of that movement in the 1990s was actually a significant precursor to a number of the more violent civil wars that happened in the region at that time, as well as in the aughts. So this could have similarly detrimental impact. There's already significant violence in the AES states, so that could only escalate as their economies deteriorate in the face of the loss of de facto freedom of movement and trade in the region. But on the upside, I don't know that the three states in question, Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, are as integrated into those plantation economies as some of the other states are. Most of those plantations are closer to the coast. And it's notable that pretty much all three states in the AES are not coastal states. They're very much inland. So it might not be as bad as it was in the 90s and aughts in that regard. The other problem is jihadis. There's, of course, significant rebellions happening in all three states, especially Burkina Faso, which I remind everybody currently does not control 40% of its territory, which is currently controlled by insurgents of one kind or another. So it may be that by pulling out of ECOWAS and ending cooperation with member states in ECOWAS over transnational threats like terrorism and insurgencies and jihadis and whatnot, it may be that those problems get worse. They've already kicked out the French and lost any benefit they got from that. And it's not really clear how beneficial the arrangement with the Russian mercenaries has been. Some of the early returns in that regard have not been entirely encouraging. It doesn't really seem like they're having an effect on the trajectory of their respective conflicts, but maybe they just need more time. We just need more time is a common refrain amongst advocates of counterinsurgency, though. Anybody who's paid attention to the Vietnam War or the Iraq War or the Afghan War involving the United States knows all about that. But hey, maybe it'll be different this time. But yeah, those are the concerns going forward for the AES. It doesn't look like there's going to be substantive punishment from ECOWAS, but neither does it seem like the breakaway states have anything resembling an actual plan for dealing with any of the substantive policy problems facing them. So good luck with that. I suspect it's going to end badly, but that's pretty much par for the course for the 2020s. So maybe not a surprise in that regard.
It'd be interesting to see what kind of organizations develop within Africa and how Africa will eventually be a lot more integrated with us on the internet. Because currently we have pretty low representation, at least in a place like Twitch chat, for gamers from that realm and so on. But Nigeria is developing a lot. We do have a South African viewer who's a regular here, can install COD. Welcome.
Hope he's doing well.
Yeah.
Hopefully the electricity is on. I guess it must be if he's watching. I guess everybody does have generators at this point, though, so maybe it's not that big a deal anymore.
Mm.
We did have two more questions. What is it about the Balkan region that caused it to be such a volatile region in the 20th century? I think that definitely comes down to historical factors. Obviously, there's a lot of ethnic diversity there, but you could say that about any part of Europe. Historically speaking, Europe has always been very ethnically diverse. But some of the more stable, wealthy parts of Europe benefited from being able to construct powerful centralized states. And over time, those centralized states were able to even out the differences, smooth out the differences between different ethnic groups and solidify them behind the state. This was especially important in the 19th century when nationalism really emerged as a major political force. Because, looking at France, for example, the effect of French nationalism was homogenizing. They had a lot of different groups that spoke different languages. Not too different, but generally different dialects of French of one kind or another. And because of the centralized nationalist government that was formed over, obviously in the early 1800s, but then again later after the monarchy was pushed aside in favor of restored republican rule, The policies they implemented were homogenizing. They had one variety of the French language that everybody was supposed to learn, and then they had one French identity that everybody was supposed to rally behind. And so the effect was to significantly water down whatever localized ethnic tensions may have been pre-existing. And there was a similar effect in Germany over time, in Britain, Spain, etc., Italy. All of these states had been able to create a single identity out of what had been actually very disparate identities. Now, the trouble with the Balkans, besides the fact that they have relatively more ethnic diversity than Western Europe, not everybody in the Balkans is some variety of Hungarian or Slav or what have you. But more problematic is the fact that it was controlled by the Ottoman Empire up until late 1800s or so. Except for Greece, I guess that would have been early 1800s. But the reason that was problematic is that the region basically missed out on much of the Renaissance and then much of the state building that occurred in the wake of the Renaissance over the course of the 1700s and 1800s. So whereas the rest of Europe, especially Western Europe, was building up strong states with strong regional identities, strong national identities, rather, the Balkans, meanwhile, was left to start from scratch after getting independence from the Ottoman Empire in the late 1800s. And, they've tried since then to catch up, but it's been very hit or miss, because obviously there's not a single state to kind of organize everybody. Austria-Hungary, to a degree, filled that role, but the trouble there is that they could never realistically construct a single ethnic identity out of all the different groups that lived in Austria-Hungary. And there wasn't really much interest, regardless, in constructing such an identity because Austria-Hungary was a very conservative monarchy. For them, nationalism was just another branch of liberalism, which was seen as dangerous by every monarchy on the continent. And so the Austro-Hungarians, specifically the Habsburg royal family, tried to resist liberalism in all its forms as long as they could. But the result of that was not the eventual successful navigation of a quote-unquote liberal moment, as I'm sure they thought of it, but rather the building up of nationalist liberal pressure over time that eventually exploded and destroyed the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, yeah, that was a very disadvantageous starting position for the region. Between the Ottomans and the Austro-Hungarians, they just did not have a lot of modernizing forces to steer them towards the kind of homogenizing state building that occurred in the West and was much to their benefit. So Yugoslavia was constructed out of big parts of the region. They kind of sort of tried to do that, but there was just too much drama for that to realistically work. Maybe if there had not been, the 30s, World War II, the Cold War and communism in Yugoslavia, and then the collapse of communism in Yugoslavia. The fact that all of that happened pretty much sabotaged Yugoslavia's potential as the main centralizing authority that could have constructed a stable Yugoslav identity and state. There was just too much interference in that process to really make it viable over the long run. So, that's why that particular area of the Balkans is where it is. I think it's telling then that Bulgaria and Romania have done much better in that regard and are in turn much more stable. It's much less of a dumpster fire in that part of the Balkans. And then there's Hungary. What do you say about Hungary? To a degree, you could say the fact that they had their wings clipped after World War I. And by that, I mean, for those of you who don't know, Austria-Hungary, as the name implies, involved two kingdoms, the Kingdom of Austria and the Kingdom of Hungary, that were kind of sort of supposed to be equal, but actually were not. But we don't need to get too much into the weeds on that. But there was a Kingdom of Hungary within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And that was more or less congruent with the extent of ethnic Hungarian settlements in the Balkans. And after World War I, Hungary was made an independent state, like a lot of constituent parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But the Hungarians lost a big chunk of their territory. Big swaths of it were cut out and given to Romania, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, what have you. And, partly that was done because while Hungarians lived in those bits of territory, they were not clear-cut majorities. In some cases, clear-cut minorities. If you're a Hungarian nationalist, that doesn't really matter. It's upsetting regardless. There are still lots of Hungarian nationalists even today who are very butthurt about that. But regardless, it ended up probably benefiting Hungary because it meant that they had a fairly ethnically homogenous state without a lot of ethnic minorities, which definitely would have been the case if they had maintained their pre-war borders. So the result is that they were able to build a relatively strong state and had a relatively easy time building a strong homogenized identity after World War I. So, out of all the states in the region, Hungary is probably the most advanced in that regard. Maybe Slovenia is up there. Slovenia's economy is really relatively good for the region. So, maybe they're in the running too. But I think the Hungarian state is maybe stronger than Slovenia. So they're probably in the lead as far as catching up to the West in terms of state building and in terms of ethnic identity. But of course, there's the whole liberal Democrat Orban thing. But that's neither here nor there. There's no rule that says the process of state building has to be towards representative liberal democracy. State building just requires building the administrative capacity of the state. Whether it's representative or not is an extra feature. You don't necessarily need to do that. Keep in mind, all of the major states of Europe became strong, developed before they became representative democracies. France did not start out as a republic, very much the opposite. And the same can be said of, the British or, the Spanish, whoever you want to point to. Maybe the Dutch are an exception, but, you can say that about a lot of things in European history. But for the vast majority of states, they all started with absolute monarchy and then built up their states and then transitioned into representative democracies. So that's a process that the Balkans just started late. So I think that maybe more than anything is the reason why they've had so many difficulties. And again, I would reiterate that it's not all of the Balkans that are having problems. If you're living in, say, Slovenia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, you don't have nearly as many problems as, say, Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, what have you. That there was quite the shitstorm in that particular area of the Balkans in the 1990s, and that kind of gave the region as a whole a negative reputation. But even in those areas, things have calmed down. They've been heating up a little more lately, but for the most part, much, much calmer than they were in the 90s. So, the reputation is not entirely deserved at this point. We'll see if they can keep it together long enough over the next 20 to 40 years to maybe solidify the gains that have been made and maybe just stay stable, quiet, and prosperous. But we'll see. Still early days in that regard. Let's see, what's my take on the recent news with Kenya's recent coup attempt and the president's dismissal of numerous ministers? I haven't been paying as much attention to Africa news, so I'm not as familiar with that. I think I do briefly remember reading a little bit about it. But from what I recall, the coup pretty much went nowhere. It was pretty much over and done with very quickly. But if I'm mistaken, let me know in that regard. But yeah, I don't really have much to add to that. It's certainly not remained the main talking point in Kenya. I think we were talking about Kenya last time. So the main thing going on over there were the mass protests over the tax hikes. So, if it were a more substantive coup attempt, I imagine that would still be in the news. But as is, it seems Kenyans have moved beyond it. So I don't know. I'm guessing that it was not that big a deal in the grand scheme of things. Africa is kind of underreported, and I don't pay as much attention to it correspondingly. I'd say I've probably paid more attention to West Africa and East Africa specifically. I guess North Africa too, but I think we've talked before about how North Africa is part of Africa, but is frequently, kind of excluded from it because it has much more in common with the Middle East. So I kind of suffer from that malady too. In my head, I think of that as Arab world, not so much Africa, but North Africa is technically Africa. So yeah, I guess I do pay attention to that as well. And I do hear occasional news about the Union of South Africa, the country, but not so much the region around it. Not nearly as much about that. I've read about South Africa within the past month, easily. but I can't remember the last time I read something in the news about like Malawi or Namibia, Botswana, right? These are countries you really don't hear much about unless something like really bad is going on or something like that. So I couldn't tell you what's going on in those places. Let's see. So we tapped out questions again.
Chat saying that Hungary has a nice capital.
Budapest? That's what I've heard. Also, one of, if not the leading producer of pornography in Europe.
Valid.
Little random trivia for you. Yeah, whenever I hear that Budapest is a major center of new media in Europe and that it's a big part of the local economy, that's the thing I immediately think of. Like, oh yeah, they're making porn. They don't advertise that. It's always like, oh yeah, media, quote unquote, wink wink.
What kind of media? Has no one been banned in chat yet today? Man, I was way off. Wow.
Well, I mean, I guess maybe people got it out of their system yesterday and earlier today.
Yeah, maybe. Good job, chat.
Yeah, if he had been killed, probably would be different. I imagine not only chat, but also probably broad swaths of the United States would be much more aggravated. But as is, he missed, so not as much to complain about. We might jump into BG3 a little early.
I'm down.
If it's okay with you.
Yeah.
Because I'm light for this week because I was spending more time preparing for the trip. Or again, just being anxiety ridden over the trip.
Whoa, 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 whoa.
It's pretty much the same thing for me.
Oh, no. Oh, what the
Hedgie5, thank you for throwing down to support this world discussion with Agent Smith. Do you pack? I would guess you pack pretty light. You bring what? A backpack and a bag? Will you check a bag?
I'm going to have a carry-on bag for under the seat, and then I'm going to have check-in. So a bigger bag for that. So, yeah, the only reason I'm doing like the big check-in bag is because I was told that there would be a gift exchange, basically. We always buy each other stuff and exchange when we eventually see each other again. So I was told that I would need extra space in my luggage because they accidentally bought too much stuff. They ordered something for me, but then the order ended up being unexpectedly large. So I'm going to get more stuff than either of us have been bargaining.
Unexpectedly large gifts.
Yeah, actually, it's we talked about it before. Oh hell, what was it? It was like the beet juice. No, not the beet juice. Sour beet juice, something like that. It was the stuff I told you about that helps with spicy food.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. So I asked for some of the Chinese version of that, and they said, yeah, sure, no problem. I'll get some, and then they placed an order, not realizing it was like an industrial strength fucking order of shit.
Nice.
So yeah, I'm gonna get like a crate of this stuff that I was talking about.
Sweet. Well, hope you have a great trip. It's a really nice time of year to hit up Seattle. And travel is usually boring, but the anxiety that we feel is our brain telling our body this is important, and we're going through a few steps here that impact our survival. It is riskier to leave the home, but it can be rewarding with the experiences you gain outside.
I concur. I think it'll be good for me. I don't doubt that.
You visited Kukio and I when we were in the Bremerton
Vancouver
area, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Went to an awesome Indian restaurant with you guys up there. Really liked it.
Vancouver's a hotspot for culinary variety. There's a huge Asian community, so all kinds of different Asian food and really top tier quality of people who just migrated over, and then surprisingly a shitload of different Indian foods and people from India.
Oh yeah. Sour plum, that's what it was. Yeah, there's a lot of Chinese and Indian immigration into Canada.
Mm.
And Vancouver in particular has been a big recipient of the Chinese migrants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they've
Yeah,
driven up the real estate market there quite a bit.
Well, I mean, that's pretty much true of all. That's pretty much true of North America.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, it's not that the Chinese have driven it up. It's just that property prices across North America have just been trending upwards for a long time now, in both the U.S. and Canada. So, certainly Chinese buyers are a factor there, but I don't think it's the decisive factor. It has more to do with what had been relatively low interest rates, cheap loans, basically. Mm-hmm. The housing boom, regulations. There's a lot of factors that go into that. So I don't want to just put all the blame on the foreigners. Mm-hmm. Some people kind of fall into a trap with regard to that. If you got rid of the foreigners, you're not solving the housing problems. I'll just say that much. And I'm not just saying that because I have friends from China who have bought property here.
Not biased at all.
Not biased at all. I'm totally not staying at a really nice house up in the Pacific Northwest for the next week.
Hope you have an awesome time. There was one more question about the NATO summit, I think.
Yeah.
What decisions were made at the summit, and how can it reshape the Russo-Ukrainian war?
It's definitely not going to reshape it. Mm-hmm. There was nothing dramatic enough to reshape the course of the war at this point. As I recall, two things off the top of my head. I think the main thing from the perspective of the United States was that there was an agreement to send more surface-to-air missile systems as well as more munitions for those systems. I believe primarily they were Patriot missile systems, but I think there might have been some others. I believe there were also other countries in NATO that agreed to send SAM systems. One of the concerns that the Ukrainians have had for most of this year has been the weakening of their air defenses. A lot of that just came out of the decline in deliveries from the United States as a result of the decline in aid that resulted from the delay in the passage of a new aid package in Congress, because of course that was delayed for like 6 months, 7 months, however long it was. And so they ended up light on munitions for their SAM systems, as well as lacked replacements for SAM systems that were lost in the line of duty. And correspondingly, their air defenses weakened a bit, with a correspondingly negative effect on battlefield outcomes. The Russians were able to more freely fly aircraft closer to the front line and drop what the media calls glide bombs. They're basically just normal, GPS bombs. They're pretty much all GPS bombs are glide bombs at this point. But they were able to use those more liberally, and it did have a destructive impact on a couple of the areas where the Russians were pushing the hardest. And also the Russians were able to just throw more shit at Ukraine, both at the electrical power grid, cities in general, and the front line in the form of things like cruise missiles, loitering munitions, drones, mostly the larger Shahed drones, but to a lesser degree the FPV drones. Because their air defenses were weaker, more of those munitions were able to get through Ukraine's air defenses and wreak more havoc. So casualties definitely have ticked up over the course of the year on account of that. So the Ukrainians were definitely asking the West, and specifically the United States, for more help in that regard. So one of the outcomes of the NATO summit is that Washington did agree to do that, to give them more stuff, as well as the rest of NATO, to kind of bolster those air defenses. The other thing was a nominal agreement with Poland that may or may not actually be implemented. They agreed to talk about it, basically, but nothing is settled yet. The idea is that some Russian cruise missiles will actually fly across Belarus and then very briefly across Polish territory on their way to targets in western Ukraine. It's probably being done by accident, but what the Ukrainians and Poles are saying is that, the Poles want to shoot down the missiles, but if they shoot them down over Poland, there's the potential danger that debris hurts somebody on the ground, and wouldn't it make more sense to shoot them down over Ukrainian territory before they enter Polish territory? And the Ukrainians say, yes, that is a very good idea. We totally support that. You should definitely do that. So basically, it's like an excuse for the Poles to shoot down the occasional Russian cruise missile that accidentally wanders into their territory on the way to Western Ukraine. And, that's a very small minority of missiles that have done that. But, every little bit helps. And so the Ukrainians and the Poles are talking about trying to set that up and to have that be a thing, where the Poles will do that. So we'll see what happens with that. I saw somebody online arguing that would be very dangerous for the Poles, and I think that's total bullshit. They're totally within their rights to shoot down stuff over their own airspace, certainly, but also to shoot down stuff in Ukraine's airspace that is on the way to Poland's airspace. So I don't think that's escalatory at all. I'm sure the Russians will complain about it, but they complain about everything at this point, so no shock. So it's a pretty reasonable strategy to my mind. But again, nothing has been agreed or finalized in that regard, so we'll see. I think those are the two main things that came out of the summit. I think everything else was mostly just posturing and just nominal stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I didn't really have high. Go ahead.
There was one other random question about a Russian unit that defected in their unit. They heard about this on Reddit.
I had not heard about that, so that's news to me.
Yeah, I guess they turned on their troop or something.
Yeah. It's possible. I can't rule it out. I'd have to look more into it.
Well, cool. Good job, chat, being very well behaved today. I'm kind of surprised, but we do have a good community here.
I appreciate you giving me the opportunity.
Hell yeah.
I'm sorry we don't have more of substance to talk about today.
It's okay. Also, chat, if you think of a historical event or something, sometimes we'll take a bite and stuff like that. I've been pretty busy catching up with streaming again and catching up with Trisha post-subathon, so I haven't been as much into reading and that sort of thing. But we've done stuff like Eastern Front, World War II. Oh, no, we did Western Front in World War II as like a big series kind of a thing, which is obviously higher effort for you to gather everything. But one really funny mini game with talking to you is randomly asking you about a country and a time period and seeing what your brain has on it.
Yeah, that's always fun. Yeah, we never did do the Eastern Front.
Mm-hmm.
I was really preparing for it like January 22 because Russia was in the news, so I thought that might be an auspicious time.
Mm-hmm. And
then the war started, and I was like, well, maybe that's not the most tasteful choice to make.
Yeah, looks like the Eastern Front is still going.
Yeah. Unfortunately so.
Well, cool. We can put a pin in this one for some world discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.